The fog came wrong that morning. It rolled across the grounds of Whitmore Hall 3 hours before dawn, thick and cold as a drowned man's breath, clinging to the magnolia trees until their ancient branches disappeared into grey nothingness. This was Georgia in late September, when the air should hang heavy and warm, when mosquitoes should swarm the tobacco fields and the earth should still hold summer's fever. But the cold had settled into the plantation like an uninvited guest, and with it came a silence that made even the insects hold their tongues. Delphine Crane had not slept. She sat in the attic sewing room where she'd spent the last 6 months of her life, her spine curved over the wedding gown that sprawled across her lap like a corpse in its burial clothes. The single candle beside her had burned down to a stub, its flame guttering in the draft that leaked through the warped floorboards. Her needle moved with mechanical precision, in, out, completing the final hem with stitches so small they seemed to disappear into the fabric itself. The dress was a masterpiece, though the word felt obscene in her mouth. Silk imported from France, so white it hurts to look at in direct sunlight. Valenciennes lace at the collar and cuffs, seed pearls sewn in constellation patterns across the bodice. The sleeves were tight to the elbow, then flared with layers of tulle that would float like wings when the bride moved. Delphine had poured every skill she possessed into this creation, every technique her mother had taught her before the fever took her, before Delphine herself had been sold south to the Whitmores when she was barely 14. 23 years. 23 years of her life were spent in this house. Her hands trembled as she pulled the thread tight. In the grey light seeping through the attic's single window, she could see her fingers, calloused and scarred, the nails broken and discolored. The trembling had started 2 months ago and never stopped. It made the fine work difficult, made her prick her fingers until tiny blooms of blood appeared on the white silk. She'd had to wash it 3 times, re-stitch entire sections. Miss Evangeline never noticed. Miss Evangeline never noticed anything except her own reflection. Delphine's needle paused. She reached into the pocket of her threadbare work dress and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were strands of her own hair, coarse, black, still carrying the oils of her scalp. She'd been cutting it for weeks, gathering it in secret. Now, with movements that felt distant from her own body, as if she were watching someone else's hands, she began weaving the strands into the hem of the wedding gown. "Mama taught me this," she whispered to the empty attic. Her voice sounded strange, amused. "Mama said you sew a piece of yourself into every garment. Make it remember you. Make it carry your intention." The hair disappeared into the white silk, invisible unless you knew to look for it. Delphine's lips moved as she worked, forming words her daughter had taught her. Little Mercy, only 6 years old, who'd learned songs from the older women who still remembered the old ways, the words from across the water that weren't English or French or anything the masters understood. "Kanga muna muntu wan kanu," Delphine breathed, not understanding the words but feeling their weight. Mercy had sung them during her fever, her small body burning hot enough to cook eggs on her forehead. "Kanga muna muntu wan kanu." Bind the bad person. That's what Mercy had said the words meant, in the lucid moments before the fever took her mind completely. Delphine's needle moved faster now, finishing the hem with hair woven throughout. She thought of Mercy's small body, how light it had been when Delphine carried her to the unmarked plot beyond the tobacco fields. How the ground had been hard, unyielding, and she'd had to dig the grave herself with a rusted shovel while Silas kept watch to make sure no one saw her taking time from her work to bury her child. Miss Evangeline had laughed when Delphine begged for quinine. "Actually I laughed, a tinkling sound like glass breaking. It's just a fever, Delphine. Children get fevers. She'll recover or she won't, that's the Lord's decision, not mine. Besides, you know how expensive medicine is. We can't spare it for every sniffle in the quarters. Really, you people breed so prolifically, it hardly matters. She's replaceable." Replaceable. Delphine knotted the final thread and bit it clean with her teeth. The dress was complete. Perfect. A shroud fit for a bride walking to her grave. She stood, her joints cracking from hours of sitting in the same position. The attic room was barely 5 feet tall at its peak, and she had to stoop as she moved toward the dress form where the gown would hang. Around her, the attic stretched into shadows, piles of fabric scraps, boxes of old clothes, a broken spinning wheel that leaned against the wall like a drunk. Dust motes swirled in the grey light, and for a moment, Delphine could swear she saw Mercy standing in the corner, her small face watching with knowing eyes. "Mama?" The word formed on Delphine's lips, but no sound came out. The vision, if it had been a vision, dissolved into shadow. Delphine carefully draped the wedding gown over the form, arranging the skirts so they fell just so, making sure the train lay smooth. Then she gathered her sewing implements, scissors, pins, the various needles, and placed them in her basket. Her fingers brushed against something cold and hard at the bottom. The boning knife. She'd taken it from the kitchen 3 days ago, when Cato was butchering a hog. Small enough to hide but sharp enough to slice through muscle and sinew. She'd been keeping it wrapped in an old rag, tucked into her bodice during the day, under her pallet at night. She wasn't entirely sure why she'd taken it. The impulse had come to her like a whisper, like Mercy's ghost speaking instructions she couldn't quite hear. But now, looking at the white wedding gown hanging in the grey dawn light, she understood. Delphine descended the narrow attic stairs, each wooden step groaning under her weight. The house was beginning to wake, she could hear the clatter of pots in the kitchen below, the heavy footsteps of Master Edmund making his morning rounds, the shrill voice of Mistress Cordelia barking orders at someone. Whitmore Hall rose around her like the ribs of some great beast, all dark wood and peeling wallpaper, chandelier crystals that caught the light and threw it in fractured patterns across the walls. Beautiful. Everything here was so terribly beautiful. And rotting. She could smell it, had always been able to smell it, the decay beneath the perfume. Black mold growing behind the silk wallpaper. Floorboards are soft with termite damage. The whole structure slowly collapsing in on itself, maintained only through the labor of people who would never own a single plank of its wood. The kitchen was chaotic. Cato stood at the massive iron stove, his dark skin gleaming with sweat as he tended 3 pots simultaneously. He was a mountain of a man, hands like dinner plates, but he moved with surprising grace, his wooden spoon dancing from pot to pot. Abigail, barely 16, scrubbed at a pile of silver serving dishes in the corner, her thin arms working mechanically. Her dress was soaked through with dishwater, and Delphine could see the brand on her forearm, AW, for Whitmore, burned into her flesh 3 months ago when she'd broken Mistress Cordelia's favorite teacup. Silas wasn't in the kitchen, but Delphine could see him through the window, leading a horse toward the carriage house. Tall and rangy, with scars across his back that showed even through his shirt. His wife, Ruth, had been beautiful. Had been. Delphine. Cato's voice was low, careful. Dress finished? She nodded, unable to trust her voice. He studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, you look different. Do I? Calm, he said. Too calm. Like you've decided something. Abigail looked up from her scrubbing, her young face pinched with exhaustion. Leave her be, Cato. We've all decided things. The difference is whether we got the courage to follow through. Delphine moved to the window, looking out at the front grounds. In the distance, beyond the Oak Line Drive, she could see the first carriages arriving. Guests from Savannah, from Charleston, from as far as Atlanta. They came dressed in their finest, parasols twirling, top hats gleaming. They came to watch Miss Evangeline Whitmore marry Preston Ashford III, to eat roasted pig and drink champagne, to dance on the lawn while the enslaved musicians played. They came to celebrate love. Delphine's hand slipped into her apron pocket, fingers closing around the handle of the boning knife. It felt right there, solid and real. She thought of Mercy's unmarked grave. She thought of the white silk gown hanging in the attic, her hair woven into its hem, her whispered curse sewn into every stitch. She thought of Miss Evangeline's laugh. Delphine? Abigail's voice, younger and more frightened. You all right? Yes, Delphine said, and meant it. For the first time in 2 months, she felt all right. She felt clear. She felt like she was finally waking from a nightmare that had lasted her entire life. Behind her, Cato and Abigail exchanged glances. They couldn't see her face, but they could see her shoulders, straight now, no longer bowed. They could see her reflection in the window glass, and the strange, terrible serenity that had settled over her features. Outside, more carriages arrived. The fog was burning off now, revealing the manicured gardens, the white columns of Whitmore Hall's facade, the ancient magnolia tree where the ceremony would take place that afternoon. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked exactly as it should. Delphine smiled. By sunset, she thought, this will all be ashes. She didn't know yet that the others were thinking the same thing. She didn't know that Cato had been sharpening his carving knife every night for a week. She didn't know that Abigail had hidden a fireplace poker beneath a pile of rags in the cellar. She didn't know that Silas had memorized the location of every weapon in the house, every route of escape, every weak point in the Whitmore's defenses. She didn't know that all across the plantation, in the fields and the stables and the servants' quarters, the enslaved workers had been watching and waiting, their anger building like a fever, like a storm, like something that had been held back for so long it had transformed into something else entirely. Something that could not be stopped. Something that would write its freedom in blood. The kitchen bell rang, summoning them to begin the day's preparations in earnest. Delphine turned from the window, her hand still resting on the knife in her pocket. She looked at Cato and Abigail, and they looked back at her, and in that moment, though no words were spoken, something passed between them. An understanding. A covenant. Today, something broke. And they would be the ones to break it. If you're enjoying this dark tale, subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our macabre stories. Drop a comment telling us what you think will happen next. The heat in the kitchen became unbearable by mid-morning. 3 ovens roared with fire, their iron mouths consuming split oak logs that Silas hauled in from the woodyard every 20 minutes. The temperature climbed until the air itself seemed to shimmer, until breathing felt like swallowing hot stones. Cato worked stripped to the waist, his torso gleaming, muscles coiling beneath skin that bore the raised scars of old whippings, a roadmap of punishment written across his back in keloid ridges. He turned the spit where 2 massive pigs rotated over open flame, their skin crackling and splitting, fat dripping into the coals with bursts of acrid smoke. Beside them, a haunch of venison roasted in one oven while 3 chickens turned golden in another. The wedding feast would feed 200 guests. It would cost more than Cato's life was worth, more than all their lives combined, tallied and sold at market. Baste them again, Mistress Cordelia's voice cut through the kitchen's din like a cleaver through bone. She stood in the doorway, a woman constructed of angles and severity. Her dress was black silk despite the heat, cinched so tight at the waist that her breathing came in shallow gasps. Her face had the pinched quality of someone perpetually tasting something bitter. In her right hand, she carried a wooden spoon, her implement of choice for discipline. Cato reached for the basting brush without a word. Not like that, you imbecile. Are you trying to ruin the glaze? She swept forward and cracked the wooden spoon across his shoulder blade, right where an old scar made the skin vulnerable. Like this. Gentle strokes. Even coating. Good God, do I have to teach you everything? Cato's jaw tightened, but his expression remained carefully neutral. Yes, mistress. My apologies. She struck him again, harder. Your apologies mean nothing. Results are what matter. These guests are the cream of Georgia society. The Ashfords are Charleston royalty. This wedding will be discussed for years, and I will not have it remembered because of poorly prepared meat. Do you understand me? Yes, mistress. Cordelia turned her attention to Abigail, who was arranging oysters on silver platters near the preparation table. The girl's hands shook slightly as she worked, placing each oyster with excruciating care. Her arms were submerged in ice water up to the elbows, and her fingers had turned an alarming shade of blue. Those oysters are unevenly spaced. Cordelia's voice dropped to something almost conversational, which was somehow worse than shouting. Do you know what happens to careless girls who cannot perform simple tasks? Abigail kept her eyes down. Yes, mistress. Tell me. They get punished, mistress. They get corrected, Cordelia said, as if explaining basic arithmetic to a slow child. She grabbed Abigail's wrist and thrust her hand into the bucket of ice water, holding it there. Perfection, Abigail. That is what is required today. Not adequacy. Not good enough. Perfection. She held Abigail's hand submerged for a count of 10 before releasing it. The girl gasped but didn't cry out, she'd learned better than that. Crying only made it worse. Cordelia swept back toward the door, pausing to inspect a tray of petit fours that Delphine had been decorating with spun sugar. She studied them for a long moment, and everyone in the kitchen held their breath. Acceptable, she finally said, then vanished back into the house. The kitchen exhaled collectively. One day, Abigail whispered, so quietly it was almost inaudible beneath the crackling fires, I'm going to take that spoon, Anne. Hush. Cato's voice was gentle but firm. Not today. Today we survive. That's all. But Delphine, who stood at the far counter rolling pastry dough, heard something different in his tone. A lie, poorly told. He didn't believe what he was saying anymore. None of them did. 3 years earlier. Summer, 1853. Cato's son, Benjamin, was 12 years old and already taller than most grown men. He had his father's broad shoulders, his mother's gentle eyes. He was clever with numbers, could calculate measurements in his head faster than Master Edmund with his ledger and spectacles. That's what doomed him. A cotton broker from Mississippi came through, looking for prime stock, young, strong, intelligent. The kind that could be trained as overseers, that could read and write well enough to manage accounts. The kind worth 3 times the usual price. Master Edmund saw dollar signs. But he's just a boy, Cato had begged, on his knees in Edmund's study, hat literally in hand. Please, master. I'll work double. I'll never complain again. Just let him stay. Edmund had looked at him with something almost resembling pity. Cato, you're an excellent cook. Truly. But you have to understand, this is business. Benjamin will have a good life. Better than here, probably. He'll be valued for his mind, not just his muscles. You should be proud. They took Benjamin on a Tuesday morning. Chained him to 7 other souls in the back of a wagon. Cato tried to run after them, but Silas and 2 others held him back, knowing that following would only mean a bullet in his back. Benjamin looked over his shoulder as the wagon pulled away, his young face trying so hard to be brave, and Cato saw his son's lips form words he couldn't hear over the distance. I love you, Papa. That was the last time Cato saw him. For weeks afterward, Cato moved through the kitchen like a ghost. He cooked because he was told to cook. He breathed because his body insisted on it. But the light behind his eyes had gone out, replaced by something cold and patient. Something that could wait. Present day. Mid-morning. Silas entered through the back door, carrying another load of firewood. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, clinging to the topography of scars that covered his back. He was 38 but looked 50, his face weathered and lined beyond his years. He caught Delphine's eye as he stacked the wood near the ovens. A moment of recognition passed between them, 2 people who had lost everything that mattered, still breathing, still working, still waiting for something they couldn't quite name. More carriages, Silas said to no one in particular. There must be 40 guests here already. Coming from as far as Virginia, I heard. The Ashford family brought an entourage, 12 people just in their party. The more witnesses, the better, Abigail muttered, then caught herself, eyes widening with fear at what she'd said aloud. Cato looked up sharply from the roasting pigs. Witnesses to what? Abigail's mouth opened and closed. Her eyes darted to Delphine, then away. Nothing. I didn't mean anything. But Delphine understood. She set down her rolling pin and turned to face them, flour dusting her hands white as bone. When she spoke, her voice had that strange flat quality again, the one that made the others uncomfortable. To a wedding, Delphine said. Witnesses to a wedding. What else would there be? The kitchen fell silent except for the crackling fires and the steady drip of pig fat into the coals. Silas moved closer, his voice dropping. Delphine. You all right? You seem different. Since Mercy. Since Mercy died. Delphine finished for him. You can say it, Silas. She's dead. My baby is dead because Miss Evangeline decided medicine was too expensive to waste on replaceable property. The word replaceable hung in the air like smoke. Cato wiped his hands on a rag, his movements careful and deliberate. We all carry pain, Delphine. God knows we all do. But talking like this, thinking like this, it's dangerous. More dangerous than living like this. Delphine's voice remained eerily calm. More dangerous than waiting for them to take everything else from us. They already took your son, Cato. They took Silas's wife. They branded Abigail like cattle. What's left for them to take except our last breaths? Delphine. I had a vision last night. She continued as if he hadn't spoken, her eyes focused on something beyond the kitchen walls. Clear as day. I saw this house burning. I saw the Whitmores screaming. I saw all of us walking away, walking north, walking free. And you know what I heard? I heard Mercy laughing. Actually laughing, like she used to before the fever took her mind. Abigail had gone pale. That's just grief talking. Just. No. Delphine's voice sharpened. It's clear. For the first time in my life, I see things clearly. We've been so afraid for so long that we've forgotten we have hands. We have teeth. We have enough rage to move mountains. 2 months earlier. July, 1856. Mercy's fever started on a Monday. By Tuesday, she was burning so hot that Delphine could barely hold her. By Wednesday, she was talking to people who weren't there, her grandmother who died before Mercy was born, angels with wings made of Spanish moss, a lady in white who stood at the foot of her pallet and sang songs in languages that didn't exist. Delphine went to the big house on Thursday morning. She found Evangeline in the parlor, practicing her piano. The young woman, barely 21, with blonde ringlets and a rosebud mouth, looked up with mild annoyance when Delphine entered. Yes. What is it? I'm in the middle of my Mozart. Please, Miss Evangeline. Delphine's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. My daughter. She has a terrible fever. I know Master Edmund keeps quinine in his study. Please, just a small amount. She's so small. It wouldn't take much to. Quinine. Evangeline laughed, actually laughed, her fingers still absently playing scales on the keys. Do you have any idea how expensive quinine is, Delphine? It's imported from South America. Each dose costs more than, well, more than you're worth, frankly. Please. Delphine fell to her knees. I'm begging you. Oh, stand up. You're embarrassing yourself. Evangeline waved a hand dismissively. Children get fevers all the time. She'll recover or she won't, that's in God's hands, not mine. Besides, you people breed so prolifically, it hardly matters. She's replaceable, isn't she? You can always have another. The words landed like physical blows. Evangeline returned to her Mozart, the conversation clearly over in her mind. Delphine remained on her knees for a long moment, staring at the back of the young woman's blonde head, at the expensive silk dress, at the piano that cost enough to buy the freedom of everyone in the quarters 3 times over. Something broke inside Delphine then. Something fundamental. She felt it snap like a dry twig, and where it broke, something else grew, something dark and patient and absolutely certain. She stood. I walked out. Returned to her daughter. Mercy died on Friday morning, right as the sun came up. Her last words were in that strange language, the old words, and Delphine listened carefully, memorizing every syllable. Kanga munu muntu wan kanu. Bind the bad person. Present day. Noon. The kitchen had filled with more workers as the afternoon approached. 2 field hands, Jonas and Samuel, had been brought in to help with heavy lifting. Mary, who usually worked in the laundry, was shucking oysters with practiced efficiency. Even Ruth, Silas's wife, who rarely left the servants' quarters anymore, had been pressed into service, her hands moving mechanically as she arranged flowers in crystal vases, her eyes distant and empty. Delphine watched them all as she worked. Saw the scars they carried, visible and invisible. Saw the way they flinched at sudden noises. Saw the careful neutrality they maintained on their faces, the survival mask they'd all learned to wear. But beneath those masks, she saw something else. Something that had been growing in the darkness, fed by years of accumulated grief and rage. She saw it in the way Cato gripped his carving knife just a little too tightly. In the way Abigail's eyes lingered on Mistress Cordelia's back when she thought no one was watching. In this way Silas's jaw muscles jumped when Master Edmund walked past. They were all thinking about it. They just didn't know the others were thinking it too. There's going to be a reckoning, Delphine said softly, not quite talking to anyone, not quite talking to herself. Cato looked up sharply. What did you say? A reckoning. Today. I can feel it in my bones, in my blood. This house is going to burn, and we're going to be the ones who light the match. Jesus Christ, Delphine, Cato moved toward her, but Silas put a hand on his arm. Wait, Silas said. Let her speak. Delphine set down the sugar flowers she'd been arranging. Her hands were steady now, absolutely steady, the trembling that had plagued her for months completely gone. She looked at each of them in turn, Cato, Abigail, Silas, the others who'd stopped their work to listen. "How long?" she asked simply. "How long are we going to pretend this is survivable? They took Cato's son. They raped Silas's wife. They branded Abigail. They let my daughter die because she wasn't worth the cost of medicine. And tomorrow, they'll do worse to someone else, and the day after that, worse still. There is no bottom to their cruelty. There is no mercy waiting for us. There is only this, moment after moment of surviving until we don't." "What are you suggesting?" Abigail's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what's going to happen. Today, during the wedding, when they're all gathered together, distracted and drunk and celebrating their beautiful lives built on our backs, today is when it ends." "That's suicide," Cato said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No. Suicide is doing nothing. Suicide is another day, another year, another decade of this." Delphine's voice rose slightly. "They think we're animals. They think we're property. They think we'll endure forever because we have no choice. But we do have a choice. We've always had a choice. We just have to be brave enough to make it." Silence fell over the kitchen. Outside, they could hear the sounds of celebration beginning, musicians tuning instruments, guests laughing, the clink of champagne glasses being prepared. Inside, 10 people stood frozen, staring at each other, each one suddenly aware that they were standing at the edge of something irrevocable. "They'll hunt us down," Samuel said finally. "They'll hunt us all." "Maybe," Delphine agreed. "Or maybe we scatter. Maybe we disappear into the swamps, head north, find freedom. But either way, dying free or living enslaved. Those are the choices. And I've made mine." Cato's hand moved to the carving knife at his belt. He didn't draw it, but the gesture was enough. Abigail's fingers touched the pocket where she'd hidden a small paring knife that morning. Silas's eyes flicked toward the weapons closet where the hunting rifles were kept. "I'm tired," Ruth said suddenly. Her voice was hoarse from disuse. She rarely spoke anymore, not since the night Thomas Whitmore had forced himself on her while Silas was locked in the stable and made to listen to her screams. "I'm so tired of being afraid." "Then don't be afraid anymore," Delphine said gently. "Be angry instead. Anger is stronger than fear. Anger is what keeps your hands steady when the moment comes." Through the window, they could see guests assembling on the lawn. The ceremony would begin in 2 hours. 2 hours until Evangeline Whitmore walked down that aisle in her white silk gown, until she stood beneath the magnolia tree and spoke vows that promised forever, until she smiled that terrible smile that had haunted Delphine's nightmares for months. 2 hours until the reckoning. "I'm not saying you have to follow me," Delphine continued. "I'm not asking anyone to be brave if they can't. But I'm going to walk up to that altar this afternoon, and I'm going to show Miss Evangeline exactly what replaceable means. And if any of you want to stand with me when I do, if any of you are ready to stop surviving and start living, then you know where I'll be." She picked up the tray of sugar flowers and headed toward the door that led to the main house. Before she left, she turned back one last time. "They took everything from us," she said. "Everything except this moment. This choice. Our hands may be scarred, but they still work. Our backs may be bent, but we can still stand. And when we do, when we finally stop bowing, they'll remember us forever." She walked out, leaving the others standing in the sweltering kitchen, surrounded by roasting meat and crystal vases and all the trappings of a celebration they would never share. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Cato drew his carving knife and began sharpening it with long, deliberate strokes against a whetstone. Abigail touched the brand on her forearm, tracing the W that would mark her forever. Silas looked at his wife, at the emptiness in her eyes, and felt something inside him calcify into purpose. One by one, without speaking, they began to prepare. Not for a wedding. For a revolution. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and the fog that had clung to the grounds all morning finally burned away, revealing Whitmore Hall in all its terrible beauty. The magnolia tree stood ancient and knowing, its branches heavy with waxy white blooms. The gardens blazed with color. The house gleamed white as bone. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked exactly as it should before a massacre. The ceremony began at 4 o'clock, when the sun hung heavy and gold over the western tree line. 200 guests arranged themselves in perfect rows beneath the ancient magnolia tree, their silk fans fluttering like the wings of trapped moths. The women wore dresses in pastels, lavender, mint, blush pink, their crinolines so wide they had to sit carefully to avoid crushing their neighbors. The men perspired in black frock coats and starched collars, their top hats gleaming in the afternoon light. Children fidgeted in miniature versions of adult finery, already wilting in the heat despite the breeze that had finally arrived to chase away the morning's unnatural cold. The magnolia tree itself was a cathedral of branches, each limb twisted and gnarled with age. Some said it had been standing when the Spanish first explored these coasts, centuries before the plantation existed. Its trunk was thick as a horse cart, bark dark and deeply furrowed. White blooms the size of dinner plates perfumed the air with a scent so heavy it bordered on narcotic, sweet and slightly rotten, like beautiful things dying slowly. Garlands of Confederate jasmine wrapped around white columns that flanked the makeshift altar. Rose petals scattered the ground in crimson drifts. A string quartet played Vivaldi, the notes climbing and falling like birds uncertain of flight. Everything had been orchestrated to perfection, every detail attended to with obsessive care. At the periphery of this perfect scene, the enslaved workers stood at their stations. Silas held the reins of horses tied to hitching posts, ready to bring carriages forward when the ceremony concluded. Cato and 2 field hands manned tables laden with champagne glasses that caught the light and fractured it into rainbows. Abigail and Mary arranged the last of the flower arrangements, their hands moving with mechanical precision. Delphine stood in the shadow of the house, partially obscured by a white column. From her vantage point, she could see everything. The guests. The altar. The Reverend, a portly man named Josiah Blackwood who owned shares in 3 cotton mills and preached about Christian charity on Sundays while selling human beings on Mondays. She touched the boning knife hidden in her apron pocket. The handle was warm from her body heat, familiar now, an extension of her own hand. The music shifted. The guests rose as one, turning toward the house. The procession began. First came the flower girls, 2 of Evangeline's young cousins, tossing petals with serious concentration. Then the bridesmaids, 6 of them, each carrying bouquets of white roses and wearing identical dresses of champagne silk. They moved in synchronized steps, their faces composed in expressions of demure pleasure. Then a pause. A held breath. And finally, Evangeline. She appeared in the doorway of Whitmore Hall on her father's arm, and even Delphine, who hated her with a purity that felt almost holy, had to admit she was beautiful. The white silk gown caught the late afternoon sun and seemed to glow from within. The seed pearls across the bodice sparkled with each movement. The veil floated behind her like morning mist, held in place by a crown of orange blossoms. Her blonde ringlets were perfectly arranged, her cheeks delicately rouged, her rosebud mouth curved in a smile of absolute contentment. She looked like an angel. She looked like innocence itself. Master Edmund Whitmore walked beside her, his chest puffed with pride. At 62, he was still a commanding figure, tall, barrel-chested, with silver hair swept back from a high forehead. His face bore the ruddy complexion of a man who enjoyed his brandy, and his eyes held the casual cruelty of someone who had never questioned his right to own other human beings. They processed down the petal-strewn aisle between the rows of guests. Evangeline's train whispered across the ground behind her, 12 feet of silk that Delphine had spent 2 weeks perfecting. The guests murmured their approval, their admiration. Someone sobbed with joy, probably Evangeline's mother, Cordelia, who stood near the altar dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. At the altar stood Preston Ashford III. 24 years old, heir to a Charleston shipping fortune, tall and lean with dark hair and darker eyes. Handsome in the sharp-featured way of men who had never known hunger, never known fear, never known anything except their own supremacy. He watched Evangeline approach with an expression of satisfied acquisition, a man taking possession of a valuable asset. Delphine watched them all with eyes that saw everything and felt nothing. Her heart had gone quiet, her breath steady. She felt Mercy's presence beside her, a coldness in the air that had nothing to do with temperature. Her daughter's ghost stood there, visible only to her, wearing the burial dress that Delphine had burned in the attic. "Soon, Mama," Mercy's voice whispered, though her lips didn't move. Soon. The processional music swelled to its conclusion. Evangeline reached the altar. Edmund placed her hand in Preston's, stepped back, and took his seat beside Cordelia in the front row. Reverend Blackwood opened his Bible. Dearly beloved, his voice boomed across the assembled crowd, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Delphine began to walk. Her feet moved without conscious thought, carrying her out from the shadow of the house, past the champagne tables, between the rows of seated guests. She walked slowly, steadily, her eyes fixed on Evangeline's back, on the white silk that contained strands of Delphine's own hair, on the curse sewn into every seam. No one stopped her. The guests barely glanced her way, she was just another servant, invisible in their peripheral vision, part of the machinery that made their lives function smoothly. But the other workers noticed. Cato saw her moving and felt his hand drift to the carving knife at his belt. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. Silas slowly, casually, began moving toward the side entrance of the house where the weapons closet stood. Instituted by God in the Garden of Eden, Reverend Blackwood continued, sanctified by our Lord Jesus Christ, and signifying unto us the mystical union between Christ and his church. Delphine was 20 feet from the altar now. Close enough to see the individual seed pearls on Evangeline's dress. Close enough to smell her perfume, French, expensive, jasmine and bergamot. Close enough to hear Preston's breathing, slightly accelerated with anticipation. The sky was darkening. It shouldn't have been, the sun was still well above the horizon, but clouds had materialized from nowhere, rolling in from the east like smoke from an unseen fire. The wind picked up, sending rose petals skittering across the ground, making the garland sway. In the distance, dogs began to howl. Not the usual evening chorus, but something else, a sound of distress, of warning, of creatures sensing something wrong in the natural order. 15 feet now. Mercy's ghost walked beside her, keeping pace. Other shapes flickered at the edge of Delphine's vision, more ghosts, perhaps, or just shadows cast by the strange light. The air had gone heavy, thick, hard to breathe. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman in the third row fanned herself frantically. And is therefore not by any to be entered into unadvisedly or lightly, Reverend Blackwood droned on, oblivious, but reverently, discreetly, advisedly, soberly, and in the fear of God. 10 feet. Delphine's hand closed around the knife handle. She drew it slowly from her pocket, keeping it concealed in the folds of her dress. The blade caught a shaft of sunlight breaking through the darkening clouds, throwing a sliver of brightness across the ground. A horse whinnied sharply. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though no storm had been forecast. The magnolia tree's branches creaked and swayed, dropping white petals that spiraled down like snow in summer. Into this holy estate, Reverend Blackwood continued, turning toward Preston and Evangeline, these two persons present come now to be joined. 5 feet. Someone finally noticed her. A guest in the back row, a woman with sharp eyes, frowned and started to rise, started to say something. But Cato was suddenly there beside her, offering champagne, blocking her view with his broad body, giving Delphine 3 more seconds. 3 seconds was enough. If any person can show just cause, Reverend Blackwood intoned, why they may not be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. Silence. The wind died. The world held its breath. Delphine stepped up to the altar, directly beside Evangeline. So close she could see the individual hairs on the back of the young woman's neck. So close she could count the lace threads in her veil. Evangeline turned slightly, registering her presence with mild confusion. Delphine? What are you? Reverend Blackwood cleared his throat, annoyed at the interruption. Please return to your station. We're in the middle of. Preston Ashford, Blackwood continued quickly, trying to regain control, wilt thou have this woman to be thy wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, keep thee only unto her, so long as ye both shall live? Preston's voice rang out clear and confident, I will. Evangeline Whitmore, Blackwood turned to the bride, wilt thou have this man to be thy wedded husband, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou obey him and serve him, love, honor, and keep him, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, keep thee only unto him, so long as ye both shall live? Evangeline's smile was radiant, triumphant. She looked into Preston's eyes, her voice clear as a bell. "I do." The two words hung in the air. Delphine's hand moved. The boning knife flashed upward, catching the last rays of sunlight filtering through the magnolia branches. Time seemed to fracture. Delphine saw everything in perfect clarity, the knife's trajectory, Evangeline's profile, the exact point where the blade would enter between the fourth and fifth rib, angling upward toward the heart. She saw Mercy's ghost smile. She saw the white silk gown that had taken 6 months to create. She saw justice. The knife plunged home. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more historical horror. Comment below if you've heard of other dark events from 1856. The sound was fabric tearing. Not the wet puncture of flesh, that came silent, intimate, but the white silk splitting as the knife drove through, layers of tulle and lace parting like water. The boning knife sank deep between Evangeline's ribs, angled upward just as Delphine had imagined it 1,000 times in the dark hours before dawn. Evangeline's mouth opened. No scream came, only a small gasp of confusion, as if she'd been asked a question in a language she didn't understand. Her blue eyes went wide, searching Delphine's face for explanation, for mercy, for some acknowledgement that this couldn't possibly be happening. "Replaceable," Delphine whispered, her lips so close to Evangeline's ear that no one else could hear. "That's what you called her. Replaceable." She twisted the knife. Evangeline's knees buckled. The bouquet of white roses fell from her hands, petals scattering across the altar like teeth knocked loose. Preston lunged forward, catching her by the shoulders, his face a mask of incomprehension. The bride's weight dragged them both down, and suddenly there was blood, so much blood, blooming across the white silk in patterns that looked almost decorative, like crimson roses embroidered by some mad seamstress. For 3 heartbeats, the world froze. The guests sat paralyzed, their minds unable to process what their eyes were seeing. The string quartet's bows hung suspended over strings. Reverend Blackwood's mouth worked soundlessly, his Bible slipping from his fingers. Even the wind stopped, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then Cordelia Whitmore screamed. The sound shattered the paralysis. Chaos erupted like a kicked anthill. Women shrieked and fainted. Men shouted and stumbled over chairs trying to reach the altar. Children wailed in terror, not understanding what was happening but infected by the panic radiating from every adult around them. Master Edmund surged to his feet, his face purple with rage. "You black bitch. I'll see you flayed alive. I'll." He never finished. Cato appeared behind him, moving with the silent grace of a predator. The carving knife, 12 inches of freshly sharpened steel, flashed once in the dying sunlight. The blade opened Edmund's throat from ear to ear, so deep it nearly severed his spine. Blood sprayed in an arterial arc, drenching the guests in the front row. Edmund's hands flew to his neck, trying to hold himself together, but his life poured out between his fingers in pulsing gouts. He toppled forward, crashing into the second row of chairs, dead before he hit the ground. "Now!" Cato's voice boomed across the lawn. "Now! Now!" Abigail moved like lightning. She'd been standing near Cordelia, holding a tray of champagne glasses. She dropped the tray and swung the fireplace poker she'd hidden beneath her apron. The iron bar caught Cordelia on the side of her head with a sound like an axe splitting wet wood. The mistress's skull caved inward, her right eye bulging from the impact. She went down without a sound, her black silk dress billowing around her like vulture wings. Silas emerged from the house carrying a hunting rifle. He took 3 running steps and fired point-blank into the chest of Thomas Whitmore, the eldest son, the heir, the man who had raped his wife while forcing him to listen. The ball punched through Thomas's sternum and exploded out his back, taking chunks of spine and lung with it. Thomas staggered backward, looking down at the crater in his chest with an expression of profound surprise, then collapsed into the rose bushes. The revolt had begun. Jonas and Samuel, the field hands, produced knives from their waistbands and fell upon the overseers who'd been stationed at the periphery. These were the men who wielded whips, who hunted runaways with dogs, who administered punishments in the barn where screams couldn't reach the big house. They died quickly, efficiently, their blood soaking into the manicured grass. More enslaved workers appeared from the house, from the stables, from the gardens. They'd been waiting for this moment without knowing they were waiting, without speaking of it aloud, but when it came they moved with the coordination of a choreographed dance. Kitchen workers carried cleavers and boning knives. Stable hands brought pitchforks and shovels. Even Ruth, silent, broken Ruth, emerged with a straight razor, her face transformed from empty to purposeful. The guests panicked, stampeding toward the carriages. Some made it. Most didn't. But the workers were surgical in their violence, targeting only those who bore responsibility. The Ashford family, Preston's father who owned slave ships, his uncle who bred humans like cattle, they fell. The Hendersons who ran the auction house in Savannah, they fell. Judge Merriweather who'd never once ruled in favor of a person of color, he fell. But the merchant's wife from Atlanta who'd spoken kindly to Abigail once, who'd slipped her a biscuit, she was pushed toward a carriage and told to run. The doctor's children, too young to bear blame, they were herded away from the violence. This was justice, not madness. This was accounting, not chaos. Preston Ashford still knelt at the altar, cradling Evangeline's dying body. Blood covered his white suit, his hands, his face. He looked up at Delphine with eyes that finally understood fear, that finally knew what it felt like to be powerless. "Please," he whispered. "Please, she's dying, we need a doctor, please." Delphine crouched beside them, her face inches from his. "Where was the doctor when my daughter burned with fever? Where was Mercy when I begged for medicine?" I wasn't. "You weren't there," Delphine agreed. "You were in Charleston, living in your mansion, eating off silver plates, never once thinking about the hands that served you. Never once seeing us as human. Never once caring." Evangeline's breath came in wet, rattling gasps. Her perfect ringlets were matted with blood. Her veil had torn away, trampled in the chaos. She looked at Delphine with dimming eyes, her lips forming words that wouldn't come. "You want to know what she's saying?" Delphine leaned closer. "She's saying, how dare you? Even now, even dying, she can't believe one of us would dare raise a hand against her. She thinks she's the victim here." Evangeline's eyes fluttered closed. Her chest rose once more, fell, and didn't rise again. Preston released a sound somewhere between a sob and a scream. He lunged at Delphine, but Silas was there, rifle but crashing into the back of his skull. Preston went down in a heap beside his dead bride. All across the lawn, the violence was ending. Bodies lay scattered among overturned chairs and crushed flowers. The white columns were splattered with blood. The rose petals mixed with darker, wetter crimson. The magnolia tree's white blooms seemed to glow against the darkening sky, pure and untouched, bearing witness to the carnage below. The survivors, those who'd escaped to carriages, those who'd been deliberately spared, fled down the Oak Line Drive. Their horses' hooves thundered against packed earth, carrying news of the massacre toward Savannah, toward the authorities, toward the inevitable reckoning. But for now, for this moment, Whitmore Hall belonged to the people who'd built it. Cato stood over Master Edmund's corpse, carving knife still in hand, breathing hard. Abigail sat on the ground, poker across her lap, staring at nothing. Ruth and Silas held each other, her face buried in his chest, his arms wrapped around her like he could finally protect her. Delphine remained at the altar, kneeling in her mistress's blood. She reached out and touched Evangeline's face, closing her eyes gently, almost tenderly. Then she stood and looked around at what they'd done, at the bodies and blood and destruction. Mercy's ghost stood beside the magnolia tree, smiling. Behind her, other spirits gathered, Benjamin, Cato's son, the countless others who died on this land, worked to death, whipped to death, died of despair and fever and broken hearts. They stood in silent witness, finally avenged. "Burn it," Delphine said quietly. Cato looked at her. "What? Burn it all." Her voice grew stronger. "The house. Everything. Leave nothing but ash. Let them find only ruins when they come. Let them know we're not property to be reclaimed. We're fired. We're judgmental. We're the reckoning they should have seen coming." Thunder cracked overhead. The storm clouds that had been gathering finally broke, but instead of rain, dry lightning split the sky. A bolt struck the house's east wing, and within seconds, flames began to climb the whitewashed walls. The gods themselves, it seemed, had joined the revolt. "Then let's finish this," Cato said, and smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in 3 years. They turned toward Whitmore Hall together, toward the burning mansion and everything it represented, ready to reduce it all to memory and smoke. The fire spread with unnatural hunger. What began as a single lightning strike in the east wing became a conflagration within minutes, flames racing through the house as if following paths laid out in advance. They climbed the peeling wallpaper, devoured the silk curtains, licked across oil paintings of Whitmore ancestors who stared down with disapproving eyes even as their faces blackened and curled. Cato led a group into the kitchen, returning with armfuls of lamp oil and kerosene. They moved through the house methodically, room by room, floor by floor, anointing the spaces where they'd suffered with accelerant. Each splash of oil was a prayer, each struck match a benediction. The parlor where Evangeline had laughed at Delphine's begging, doused and set ablaze. The dining room where they'd served lavish meals while their own children starved, consumed by fire. Master Edmund's study where he'd tallied their worth in ledgers, where he'd signed bills of sale that tore families apart, the desk, the books, the precious documents, all fed to the flames. Delphine climbed the narrow stairs to the attic sewing room one final time. The space was exactly as she'd left it that morning, scraps of fabric scattered across the floor, broken needles glinting in the fading light, the dress form standing empty now, a ghost of white silk. She found Mercy's burial dress in a small trunk, the one she'd sewn with trembling hands 2 months ago, the one she'd dressed her daughter in for eternity. She held it against her chest for a moment, breathing in the faint scent that still clung to the fabric, wood smoke and rosemary, the herbs she'd tucked into the shroud. Then she laid it carefully on the work table and struck a match. The flames caught immediately, as if the dress had been waiting to burn. Delphine watched it transform from fabric to ash, watched her daughter's final earthly tether dissolve into smoke. It felt like a release. Like permission to finally let go. "Rest now, baby," she whispered. "Mama's coming home soon." She descended through the burning house, flames reaching for her on all sides but never quite touching. The heat was tremendous, the air thick with smoke, but she walked calmly, taking in every detail of the destruction. This was the house that had consumed 23 years of her life. Now she would watch it consume itself. In the cellar, Silas and Jonas were smashing open barrels, flour, sugar, salt, preserved meats. Taking what they'd need for the journey ahead, destroying what they couldn't carry so the authorities would find nothing useful in the ruins. Silas had also retrieved weapons from the closet, 3 more rifles, powder and shot, hunting knives. Tools for survival in a world that would be hunting them. "How much time do we have?" Jonas asked, his arms loaded with sacks of cornmeal. "Hour, maybe 2 before riders arrive from Savannah," Silas said. "We need to scatter before then. Groups no bigger than 3. Head in different directions. Make it impossible for them to track us all." Upstairs, Abigail moved through Mistress Cordelia's bedroom with savage efficiency. She tore the fine dresses from their wardrobes and threw them into the fire blazing in the hearth. She smashed the bottles of French perfume, ground the cosmetics into the carpet with her heel. The vanity mirror where Cordelia had admired herself while slaves starved, Abigail shattered it with the same fireplace poker she'd used to crush the woman's skull. The brand on her forearm throbbed, the W that marked her as property. She held it close to the flames, as if she could burn it away, reclaim the skin as her own. But the scar remained, a permanent testament to what she'd survived. Mary found her there, tears streaming down her face. "We have to go. The whole house is coming down." "Good," Abigail said. "Let it fall. Let it all fall." They emerged onto the second-floor landing to find the grand staircase already engulfed. Flames climbed the banister, consumed the runner carpet, turned the chandelier crystals into dripping glass tears. The portraits lining the walls, for generations of Whitmores, painted in oils, preserved for posterity, bubbled and blackened. Their faces seemed to scream silently as the fire ate them. Ruth stood in the hallway, staring at the bedroom where Thomas Whitmore had violated her. Silas approached quietly, putting a hand on her shoulder. "You want to burn it yourself?" he asked gently. She nodded, unable to speak. He handed her a bottle of kerosene. She walked into the room, the 4-poster bed with its expensive linens, the wardrobe full of fine clothes, the washstand where he'd cleaned himself after, and poured the accelerant over everything. Her hands were steady. Her face was calm. She struck the match and dropped it onto the bed. Flames whooshed upward, greedy and cleansing. She stood watching for a long moment, then turned and walked out, closing the door behind her. Closing that chapter. Sealing it with fire. I can speak again, she said to Silas, her voice hoarse but present. I thought I'd forgotten how, but I can speak. He pulled her close, his scarred back pressed against the burning wall, and they held each other while Whitmore Hall collapsed around them. Outside, the others had gathered what they could carry, food, weapons, blankets, a few tools. Samuel had retrieved documents from Edmund's study before the flames consumed them, maps, letters of transit, papers that might be forged into passes. Cato loaded everything onto a wagon, his movements efficient despite the chaos. The surviving guests who'd been tied up in the yard watched in horrified silence as the mansion burned. They'd been stripped of weapons, left bound but not harmed, witnesses to carry the tale, to spread the story of what happened when you pushed people past the breaking point. Tell them, Delphine said to a young man from Charleston, barely older than Preston had been. Tell them we're not animals. Tell them we're not property. Tell them what happens when you treat human beings like cattle. Tell them to be afraid, because this won't be the last time. This is just the beginning. The young man nodded frantically, terror making him compliant. He'd wet himself sometime during the chaos, and the shame of it showed on his face. But he'd live. He'd carry the story. He'd wake up screaming from nightmares for the rest of his life. That felt like justice too. The roof caved in with a sound like the world breaking. Sparks erupted into the darkening sky, carried by updrafts into the storm clouds above. The fire had reached the attic now, consuming the sewing room, the servants' quarters, the spaces where enslaved people had been forced to make themselves small and invisible. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark white light, the burning mansion, the scattered bodies on the lawn, the magnolia tree standing untouched like a monument to witnessed violence. Thunder followed, and finally the rain came, not the gentle drizzle of a summer shower, but a deluge, as if the heavens themselves were weeping. But it was too late. The house was too far gone. The rain hissed and steamed against the flames but couldn't extinguish them. Whitmore Hall would burn until morning, until nothing remained but the stone foundation and a few charred beams reaching toward the sky like accusations. Time to go, Cato said. We've got our reckoning. Now comes the hard part, staying free. They were divided into groups as planned. Cato would head north through the swamps with Samuel and Jonas, following rumors of underground railroad stations in Tennessee. Abigail and Mary would go west, trying to reach the Cherokee territories where some free blacks had found shelter. Silas and Ruth would take the wagon south to the Okefenokee, where Seminole communities still resisted government control. Delphine would go east, toward the coast, toward the ocean she'd never seen. She didn't have a plan beyond that. I didn't need one. She'd done what she came to do. What happened next felt less important than what had just ended. Before they separated, they stood together one last time in the rain, illuminated by the burning house. 10 people who'd been property that morning, who'd been considered 3/5 human by law, who'd been told their entire lives that they were inferior, subservient, owned. 10 people who'd just proven otherwise. They'll hunt us, Silas said. Use dogs. Offer rewards. Make examples if they catch us. Let them try, Cato replied. I'm done running scared. Done bowing. Done being less than whole. Whatever comes, at least I'll face it as a free man. Free, Ruth repeated, tasting the word. We're free. Delphine looked back at the burning mansion one last time. Through the flames, she thought she saw Mercy standing in the window of the attic sewing room, waving goodbye. Other ghosts stood with her, all the souls this place had consumed over the decades, finally released from their bondage. Thank you, Mama, Mercy's voice carried on the wind, clear and joyful. Thank you for making it right. Then the attic collapsed entirely, and the ghosts were gone, carried upward with the smoke and sparks into whatever waited beyond. The groups dispersed into the rain-soaked darkness, moving quickly before the authorities arrived. They left behind corpses and ruins, blood and ash, and a story that would be whispered about in hushed tones for generations. The night swallowed them whole, and Whitmore Hall burned on alone. 3 days after the massacre, the authorities arrived in force. 40 mounted men from Savannah, led by Sheriff Coleman Drake and accompanied by federal marshals. They brought tracking dogs, manacles, weapons, and the absolute certainty that swift justice would be delivered. What they found instead was a smoldering graveyard that defied explanation. The main house had collapsed entirely. Only the stone foundation remained intact, filled with charred timber and twisted metal, the skeletal remnants of chandeliers, the warped frames of mirrors, fragments of porcelain melted into grotesque shapes. The chimneys stood like tombstones, blackened and listing, surrounded by ash that the rain had turned to grey mud. 23 bodies lay scattered across the grounds in various states of decomposition. The Whitmore family. The Ashfords. Overseers and collaborators. All had been left where they fell, exposed to 3 days of rain and sun and the attention of carrion birds. Evangeline's white wedding gown had turned brown with dried blood, the silk shredded by crows seeking the flesh beneath. The magnolia tree stood untouched at the center of it all, its white blooms still pristine, bearing silent witness. Jesus Christ, Sheriff Drake breathed, surveying the carnage. It's a war zone. They found the surviving guests still tied in the yard, delirious from exposure, babbling incoherent stories about revolt and fire and divine judgment. Their testimonies contradicted each other. Some said there were a dozen attackers, others swore there were 50. Some claimed the enslaved workers had been possessed by demons. One woman insisted she'd seen ghosts rising from the ground to join the slaughter. The only consistent detail, it had been coordinated, purposeful, and devastatingly effective. The dogs picked up trails leading in 6 different directions. Within hours, the trackers returned, frustrated. The trails disappeared into water, swamps, creeks, the Savannah River itself. It was as if the perpetrators had simply vanished into the Georgia wilderness, swallowed by the land they'd worked for generations. Sheriff Drake authorized a manhunt that would last 3 months. Wanted posters went up across Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. Rewards were offered, $500 for information leading to capture, $2,000 for the ringleaders brought back alive. The descriptions were vague, authorities couldn't even agree on how many people they were hunting or what most of them looked like. The enslaved had been so invisible in life that even in rebellion, they remained difficult to see. Some were caught. Samuel was found 2 weeks later trying to board a northbound steamship in Charleston. He was hanged publicly in the city square, his body left to rot as a warning. 3 field hands from a neighboring plantation who joined the revolt were tracked down in the swamps. They died fighting rather than surrender, their bodies fed to the dogs as punishment. But the others, the core group, the ones who'd stood at the center of it all, they disappeared like smoke. Rumors proliferated. Cato was spotted working as a free cook in a Philadelphia tavern, though when authorities investigated, the man they found bore only a passing resemblance and carried impeccable papers. Abigail allegedly appeared in Cherokee territory, married to a tribal elder, but the tribe refused to confirm or deny. Silas and Ruth were said to have joined a Maroon community in the Okefenokee's deepest reaches, a settlement so hidden that even the Seminoles spoke of it only in whispers. And Delphine, her fate became the greatest mystery of all. A fisherman claimed he saw a black woman walking into the ocean near Tybee Island at dawn, for days after the massacre. She'd been singing, he said, in a language he didn't recognize, and when the waves reached her chest, she'd simply kept walking until the water closed over her head. He'd run to save her, but when he reached the spot, there was nothing, no body, no disturbance, just calm water reflecting the rising sun. Others reported sightings in the Blue Ridge Mountains. A seamstress who appeared in mountain towns, stayed long enough to mend clothes for free blacks and escaped slaves, then vanished before questions could be asked. She always wore the same blood-stained apron, they said, and spoke to empty air as if conversing with ghosts. A traveling minister swore he'd seen her at a crossroads in Alabama, standing beneath a hanging tree where 3 men had been lynched the week before. She'd been cutting down their bodies, treating them with a gentleness that made him weep. When he'd approached to help, she'd turned to him with eyes that held such depths of sorrow and rage that he'd fallen to his knees. By the time he'd gathered the courage to stand, she was gone. The truth, like most truths about the enslaved, would never be fully known. 2 years later. Autumn, 1858. The ruins of Whitmore Hall had become cursed ground. The property had been seized by creditors after the massacre, put up for auction 3 times. Each time, the bidding died before it began. No one wanted land that had drunk so much blood, a house that had burned with such fury. Locals claimed to hear screams on quiet nights, to see figures moving through the ruins at dusk, not threatening, just sorrowful, trapped in an endless loop of suffering and revenge. Crops wouldn't grow in the fields. 2 separate attempts to rebuild the house ended in mysterious accidents, workers injured by falling beams, tools gone missing, an inexplicable fire that consumed new lumber before a single wall could be raised. The would-be developers abandoned their plans, claiming the land itself was fighting them. The magnolia tree still stood, grown even larger somehow, its branches spreading wider each year. Its white blooms appeared regardless of season, perfuming the air with that heavy, slightly rotten sweetness. People avoided it. Horses refused to approach. Dogs whined and pulled at their leads when their owners tried to bring them near. But the tree wasn't empty. On certain nights, particularly late September, around the anniversary of the massacre, travelers reported seeing figures gathered beneath its branches. A tall man with scars on his back, holding a woman who finally looked at peace. A young girl with brands on her arms, sitting beside another girl barely 16. A mountain of a man who moved with surprising grace, keeping watch over them all. And at the center, a woman in a blood-stained apron, her hands forever moving as if sewing something invisible, her lips forming words in a language older than English, older than this blood-soaked soil, old as memory itself. The figures never threatened. They simply existed, bearing witness, ensuring the story wouldn't be forgotten even when the authorities tried to bury it. The newspapers had called it a tragic incident, downplayed the violence, suggesting the enslaved workers had been manipulated by outside agitators. But the land remembered. The magnolia remembered. And the dead, they most certainly remembered. Present day. October, 1858. A young man traveling from Savannah to Atlanta made the mistake of stopping at the ruins as the sun set. He'd heard the stories, of course, everyone had, but he was a modern man, educated at Yale, skeptical of superstition. He wanted to see the infamous sight for himself, perhaps write an article about how fear and guilt could transform tragedy into legend. He tied his horse to an oak tree well away from the ruins and walked through the overgrown grounds. Kudzu had already begun reclaiming the land, wrapping around fallen columns, strangling the rose bushes that had once been so carefully maintained. The foundation was a perfect rectangle of ash and memory, filled with rusted metal and bone-white stones. The magnolia tree drew him like a magnet. He approached slowly, notebook in hand, ready to document the experience with rational precision. The white blooms glowed in the twilight, unnaturally bright, and the air around the tree was cold despite the mild evening. That's when he saw them. Figures standing in the shadows, more solid than shadows should be. He counted 10, then 12, then lost count as more materialized from the gathering darkness. They didn't move toward him, didn't acknowledge him at all. They simply stood in silent congregations, forever gathered at the site of their liberation. At the center, the woman in the blood-stained apron turned her head slightly, as if sensing his presence. Her eyes met him across the distance, and in them he saw everything, centuries of suffering, a mother's grief, a revolution's birth, justice written in blood and fire. He ran. Stumbled back to his horse, mounted clumsily, and rode hard for Atlanta without looking back. His notebook, dropped somewhere in the ruins, was never recovered. He never wrote his article. In fact, he never spoke of what he'd seen, except once, years later, when drunk and dying. "They're still there," he whispered to the priest administering his last rites. "Still waiting. Still watching. And they'll be there forever, until this country acknowledges what it did. Until it makes amends it never will. They'll haunt that place until the soil itself cries out the truth." The ruins of Whitmore Hall stand still, overgrown and avoided, marked on no official maps. The magnolia tree grows larger with each passing year, its roots drinking deep from earth enriched by ash and blood. White blooms appear in every season, defying nature, refusing to forget. Local children dare each other to approach it after dark but never do. Old women cross themselves when passing on the road. Men traveling alone choose longer routes to avoid it entirely. Because everyone knows, even if they won't speak it aloud, some places remember. Some violence leaves scars so deep they become permanent features of the landscape. And on certain nights, when the wind blows just right, you can still hear it, the sound of fabric tearing, a bride's final gasp, the whispered words of an old curse spoken in a language the masters never understood. Kanga munu muntu wan kanu. Bind the bad person. The curse worked. The Whitmores are bound to this place forever, their spirits trapped in the ruins they built with stolen labor. And standing guard over them, ensuring they never escape, are the 10 souls who decided one September afternoon that dying free was better than living enslaved. They remain there still, in the shadows beneath the magnolia, sewing justice into the fabric of history one invisible stitch at a time, waiting for a reckoning that's still to come. The story of Whitmore Hall is officially forgotten, buried in archives, omitted from history books. But the land remembers. The Magnolia remembers. And the dead, they never, ever forget. Thank you for watching. If this story sent chills down your spine, subscribe for more macabre tales from history's shadows. What other dark historical events should we cover? Let us know in the comments below.